Thanks, Kelsey. It's really great to be with all of you tonight, and hopefully you're in a nice cozy place. I know that weather has been wild across the state, including Cook County, and so I hope that Zoom is able to bring us all together here in a way where we can learn regardless of what's going on in the great outdoors. I'm here tonight to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as Kelsey also spoke about, which is why trees? Why are they important? And what is the importance of woodlands in a changing climate? And what can we do to be adaptive and creative as things are changing? And I'll share a little bit more about my background in a minute, but my passion is kind of taking complex things and breaking them down and making them more manageable for folks so that we can be more creative and be resilient together. So that's where we've got a lot of material tonight that we'll be going through. And please do, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the text box. We'll have a space and I'll ask if anybody would like to ask a question at different times. I'd love to hear, and we can kind of brainstorm together about things that might be going on your property or any questions you may have as we go through. Next slide. So a little bit more about U of M Cook County Master Gardeners. We're a part of the University of Minnesota Extension, and we teach in a number of different areas, a lot of which are interconnected for tonight's topic. And those include horticulture skills, plant biodiversity, which is really key for tonight, pollinators, which trees and shrubs, as you'll be hearing me talk about, are a heavily impacted species for pollinators, clean water. Trees and woodlands have a big impact on clean water, local food, climate change is a key theme tonight, and then nearby nature, which woodlands are a huge part of our the biome that we live in. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the two of us. Jacob is going to speak up in just a minute and share a little bit about himself. He is interning this year as a master gardener, and so he and I are working together and exploring the great world of technology with Zoom and different classes, and we will be teaching a class that he can share a little bit more about in the fall. A little bit more about me. I was raised in Plymouth, Minnesota. My background is I'm an author of a couple of books, and then I've worked with families as a counselor as well. And so that's a little bit of that background of really liking to break things down step by step and support people in achieving their goals. And I love doing that in the world of gardening. I am a master gardener and then also a Minnesota master naturalist. And so I kind of get to wear both hats tonight, which is great. So there's a lot of overlap, especially there in the North Woods. I spend a good chunk of the year in Grand Marais, and then I'm also down in South Minneapolis as well. And I've been a Cook County resident for about 3 years or so now. I have a bunch of interests here because they're pretty varied, but I love gardening for wildlife, landscape design, sustainable gardening, pollinator gardens, native plants, woodland and lakeshore restoration, and orchids and houseplants. I actually am a big orchid nerd, and I have a kind of big collection of scented or kind of historically interesting orchids. And so if anybody wants to nerd out about orchids with me, that's a topic of mine that I love. Birding, hiking, cross-country skiing, knitting, reading, and then working in health equity advocacy in the county. Jacob, could you chime in a little bit more about yourself?
I can, thank you. Yep, my name is Jacob Baker. I've lived here for about 3.5 years now, and like Anna said, this is my first year with Extension, so I'm here primarily as a learning opportunity about the presentation process, but woodlands as well. I'm not an expert on the subject. Primarily interested in lawn care and landscaping with Extension. Not near as well rounded as Anna's interest list, but I'm interesting nonetheless. I promise. Yeah, an engineering tech here for the highway department in town. Like I said, lawn care and landscaping. I also do like to do a lot of things outdoors. Maybe not today. I'll get out in the sauna after this. That's about as outdoors as I'm going to get in this weather. But about all the things that Cook County residents are interested in. So, you know, canoeing, hiking, all that fun stuff. But thanks to Anna for the invite and the opportunity to learn here. So I'm excited to be with all of you.
And Jacob and I are going to be co-teaching a Belon's class in the fall, and we'll also be talking a little bit about kind of fall garden care and being more gentle in our gardens in the fall for wildlife. And so keep an eye out if you have an interest in that, probably in September, I think. All right, next slide, please. All right, so goals for the presentation. And before we say too much more too, I'm a visual learner, so there's a lot in these slides, as you'll see as we go through this. We are being recorded, and so if you want to come back and watch a certain part again, or just take a quick screenshot or something, if there's something that you want to really track for details and information, it's going to be there in the slide, because I love to learn visually and give you a lot of good information that way. And so the things that we'll be talking about tonight are exploring the roles that trees and woodlands play in ecosystem health, learning practical tips for establishing or revitalizing the woodland near your home, because forests and woodlands can be in different places in their maturation cycle. And so we'll be talking more about that, exploring different native tree and shrub species in Cook County and how they may be affected by climate change. We'll be breaking that down. Discussing woodland landscape design for homeowners, including fire-wise safety tips from the DNR and how that affects smart landscape design. And then exploring effective planting strategies for sustainable woodlands of the future in Cook County. So what trees contribute to our landscapes? I tend to, and almost every presentation I do talk about trees and shrubs as superheroes in the landscapes, because they really do have an outsized positive effect on our landscapes. They have an impact in every season of the year, and that can include most especially habitat for wildlife, including food sources for a variety of wildlife, protective cover areas to nest and raise young, places to perch and crawl, and access to water. And we can think about that in terms of insects that are living in the tree, the birds and other insects that might be feeding off of that food source, places to be building nests, places to be scanning if it's a raptor for things in the environment. So we're really seeing trees as a hub for wildlife and covering a variety of their needs. Their root networks help to reduce erosion. They help with having a greater drought tolerance for, compared to turf grass, for example. They're not every tree is going to be as drought tolerant as another, but those roots going in are holding the soil and also helping us get through these longer time frames between rain events. Obviously, they have cooling effects and shade, which help both wildlife and us to lower our cooling costs. They can create windbreaks. They contribute to the larger woodland habitat. They sequester carbon, improve air quality, and of course, create beauty and interest throughout the year. And we will be talking about what we can do in terms of that 4-season beauty in the woodland when we get into the design section of the presentation. So trees are a keystone species, and this may be familiar to a number of you. You can see at the top of both of these images, the tagline for Homegrown National Park, which is the work of Doug Tallamy. And basically you can get yourself on the map in your yard as a certified wildlife habitat. And so you can see, if you want to Google that, you can learn more about how to get involved. But they have a couple great images here about understanding that trees are keystone species. And what that means is it can be a plant or animal that has, again, that outsized effect in the landscape. So for example, locally, beavers are a keystone species in the Boundary Waters canoe area. They are reshaping, how water is flowing and creating habitat for other animals that everyone depends on in that landscape. And we see that, for example, in the oceans, where sea otters are eating urchins and that would otherwise be decimating kelp forests. And so otters are helping to control one population that allows kelp forests to stay healthy. So when we take a keystone species out of an ecosystem, we see a lot of negative effects that cascade. And so trees are that important keystone species across species. And they give a few examples here about native oaks, the prune family, cherries, plums, choke cherries, birch family, and native maples, and all the different caterpillar and insect species that they host, and then all of the different species that then have a positive effect as a food source and things like that based on having those trees in their environment. So understanding a little bit more about our local forest, I really tried to work tonight to zero in on Cook County as much as possible in what we're speaking to, because we do live in such a unique place in terms of climate and lake effects and mountains and forests. And so we're really right on the edge. There's a couple maps here. The one at the top shows that we're right at the edge between temperate forest and the boreal biome. And when we look at the lower map, we can see this kind of greenish ring that goes around from the North Pole around. And that is the boreal biome. And so because of our position, with the lake and being really close to Canada, we're right on the edge of that. And in some respects, that's probably the best fit for what our biome is. Technically, when we look at the map, it's probably into the temperate zone. So we kind of, depending on where we are and some of those microclimates that can happen, you may see more mesic hardwood forest, or you may see more heavily evergreen forest. So we're in that transition area between the two. And what we see when we look out our windows and back doors are predominantly evergreens with a mix of deciduous species as well, like maple, for example. And when we're thinking about the forest, it is an interconnected web of plant and animal species. And so we're not just talking about trees, we're also thinking about this community of plants and animals working together, sometimes at odds with each other, having an effect on one another as we're looking at the forest itself. And as we've touched on a little bit, microclimates can really create diverse plant and animal groupings in Cook County. My family and I were just up the Gunflint Trail a week or two ago, getting a new to us used canoe, and there was 3 to 4 feet of snow on the ground, and I could have gone out skiing. And then when we drove past a moose on our way back down the Gunflint Trail, there was hardly any snow on the ground at that particular moment near the lake. So we know that elevation, thermal effects from the lake, all of these things can have a big effect on what types of plants, what species of trees will or will not grow in certain areas. And so I think that's something that's pretty cool about Cook County, is that it really has that variation of landscape depending on where we are, and we can plant adaptively for that. So digging in a little bit into the forest community, what's a forest made up of? It has multiple interactive plants, including taller canopy trees, mid-story trees, lower story shrubs, ground level perennial plants that are going to die back. They're non-woody plants. They're going to die back every year. They're going to come back in the spring. And sometimes we see those spring ephemeral, those beautiful spring wildflowers in the forest while there's more light coming into the forest. And then mosses, lichens, and different microorganisms in the soil, they're all a part of that forest community, including, as you may have heard about, mycorrhizal fungal networks are what kind of creates that, those communication structures between trees that allow them to communicate and collaborate with one another. So it's those mycorrhizal fungal systems that are allow trees to do that. So all of these things are part of the forest community. Each of these plant groups have a specific niche in their environment, and they require different amounts of sunlight, shelter, water, and growing substrates. So a different tree might be completely shade intolerant, while another one that's a lower story tree may have much more room to have shade as a part of its life cycle, for example. And they're going to differ in terms of growth rates, lifespans, and vulnerability to stressors. So forests change over time, and they do this in a process called maturation, where we can imagine kind of different slideshows in our head about the ways that a forest can look. And so if it's a disturbed area, for example, we might have a lot of young plants and trees moving into an open area that grow very quickly. And, that snapshot of a forest is going to look very different from an established old growth forest that's had time for different species that maybe take longer to grow to become established and kind of edge out some of those quick growing trees. And so forests can vary from young to older and more established plant groupings. And part of how that process happens, in addition to time, is that there's something called succession. And that means that resources and conditions in a forest are going to change over time. And so that different plants will be favored and become more abundant. So in a younger forest, there's going to be more sunlight coming in. There might be greater access to moisture, for example. But as things mature or as certain species become more dominant, maybe trees that can handle having less moisture, for example, they may shoot up or thrive in an area where another tree may struggle. And so we're going to see changes in how forests look over time based on how trees are responding to those conditions. And one of the main ways that forests change is something called disturbance. And disturbance affects forest maturity and succession, and it's created by a variety of human and nature-made factors. And I bet we can predict a lot of these. Fire, which we just saw, recently in our area, wind and storms have a big impact. Cyclical insect activity, and that can include invasive species, but also there are native insect species that really have an effect, like spruce budworm, on our trees. Tree harvesting is an example of disturbance, active forest management, and forest fragmentation, where the larger forest gets split off from itself in smaller chunks and can make it difficult for species to migrate or to reseed, and urbanization, and finally, climate change. So taking that a little bit more locally, to our area, we see a couple of pictures on the left of two of my favorite species that we see locally. One is fireweed, and the one below is jack pine cone. So one of the things that we've seen along the North Shore, for example, has been logging in the paper industry. And so when a lot of folks drive up these days, they see a lot of birch trees, many of which are dead and dying at this point, but they see a lot of birch trees and stands of that or stands of aspen, both of which are really fast growing trees that come into disturbed areas and try to hold that soil and reestablish a forest. And so the primary species that we were generally seeing before the paper industry and the logging industry were white pines and cedars. And so we've seen a lot of shifts in the types of trees and the ratio of tree species based on that industry. And so that's one local example. I just touched on the spruce budworm cycle that we see with balsam trees and spruce trees. And it's generally, I believe, a 30 to 40 year cycle where it's kind of a boom and bust with these. It's a caterpillar that becomes a moth, and they don't necessarily completely kill a tree, but they heavily damage. And if that happens over successive years, they will kill off huge sections of balsam and spruce forest. And that's a native insect that we have that has a relationship with the forest. And when those trees die back, that creates greater spaces in the forest for other tree species. In the past couple of years, we've had some significant forest fires, near Isabella, and we've seen what that does in our local forests and near our homes. And one of the things to take away about disturbance is that this destruction can be creative if the rate of change does not exceed the forest's ability to adapt. So the forest actually needs and uses disturbance as a part of its growth process. But what we're looking at is how quickly is that happening, and can the forest respond, and what are its natural cycles that it has in place. So some common effects that we see with disturbance are that faster growing opportunistic trees will move quickly into a disturbed area. And these are often the types of species that are going to blanket an area and almost choke out the whole area for any to really grow, because so many are planted at once. So they're often, very quick growing and moving in to help stabilize a disturbed area. We'll see new light gaps. And what this can do is actually, as we see a couple slots down there, slower growing, longer living species will often grow more rapidly into a canopy when all of a sudden there's greater space for them to grow because another tree has fallen, or there's more light coming in. And so sometimes those slower growing tree species that live longer are waiting in the wings for their opportunity, and then they kind of will shoot up into the canopy when they get that light or when there's been a disturbance. For example, let's say a lot of balsam and spruce die back from that spruce budworm cycle, some of those slower growing cedars and pines and things like that may start to come up more quickly when they have that opportunity. With fire, we see that deadwood can be cleared and composted and the soil becomes fertilized. And we are in a fire-dependent forest type up in the boreal biome that we're in. And so we see things like this jack pine, where those pine cones can sit for up to 10 years and they will germinate during the heat of a fire. So it protects and holds the seeds until that fire happens. And then those seeds germinate and can begin to stabilize the forest at that point. So it uses fire and heat as well. So breaking down climate change effects. And one thing I want to say is, for me, thinking about what's happening in our environment can feel really stressful and challenging, and it's hard on my heart. But what I want to do is really try to understand the dynamics that are in place so that we can be creative, we can be adaptive, we can understand what we're working with. And so for me, that's a really important thing that can lead us, this type of disturbance, climate change as a process, can lead us to being creative and adaptive. And so that's kind of what we're doing here tonight. And I appreciate that you all are here. What we're looking at with climate change generally, and this is familiar to a lot of folks, is increased drought and longer stretches of time between rain events. But then in contrast, we often will have heavier or slower moving rain events as things are moving more slowly through the atmosphere. So we can get those heavier rains, but farther apart. And of course, we're seeing warming temperatures, but we're actually outpacing that and seeing the strongest effects of that with nighttime temperatures overall being much warmer than they were decades ago. So we're seeing an outsized effect at night, which affects frost and can affect invasive species. And then also, again, with winter temperature averages. So if we look on the right side, we're talking about more invasive plant and animal species, and where that's coming from are these warming temperatures are animals that come in different shipments, for example, jumping worms and their eggs coming in mulch or soil or things like that from the garden center. The worms themselves, the parents will not survive that, but the eggs can overwinter. And so the warmer things are at night and in the winter, the more room there is for invasive species to take hold and have an effect. We'll see greater atmospheric instability, creating more volatile storms, lightning events, and wind. And that can really affect, of course, trees and woodlands. And also, as we see on the right side, increase the risk of wildfires. When we're having that volatility, that can lead to more lightning strikes, and also a lot more dry areas can, again, contribute to that risk of wildfires. We have increased shoreline and forest erosion that can happen when we're having these bigger storms, larger wave effects, greater wind. And as trees get knocked down and their roots are coming out from under them, more soil can be eroded. One thing to understand as well is that seasonal changes to temperature can affect frost times, and that affects animal hibernation and reproduction. And so one of the things we're seeing is animals and plants are becoming out of sync with each other. So we may have some really early warm days where all of a sudden the bees and pollinators are coming out, but those food sources are not ready yet. And so they're coming out and we're not seeing food, and that can happen with different animal species as well. And so one thing that I'll touch on later in the presentation is if we can emphasize really early season pollinator species or food sources, and trees and shrubs are a huge part of that equation, that's going to have a really important effect for helping these animals resync and find as much food as early as possible. And then the final one here is just species migration. As things warm, as things dry, we're going to see animals and plant species moving around on the continent and often moving northward as those temperatures change. So planting for the future, what do those climate change effects mean for Minnesota and our forests. And so I've got a resource all the way at the end of the presentation about looking at a Minnesota assessment in terms of climate change. And what they're finding is that the most vulnerable areas are wet forests, forested rich peatlands, and acid peatlands. And so there's certainly some of that across the northern stretch of the state, maybe not quite as much of that where we are. We're going to be in this next category that's actually a little bit less vulnerable to climate change. So maybe there's a tiny piece of some good news there. Floodplain forests are less vulnerable, fire-dependent forests, and mesic hardwood forests. And mesic kind of means moderate amount of moisture. So maybe thinking of large stands of maples, for example, more of those hardwood forests, and then also those fire-dependent where we're seeing more evergreens. And so we're hoping to see every type of forest is going to be affected, but hopefully there's some more room in the species that we have in our area to be adaptive with that. And we're seeing that, again, that transition from more of a boreal evergreen heavy biome to more of a temperate hardwood forest biome. And one thing to keep in mind too is understanding that we have native species across Minnesota, including southern Minnesota. And one initiative that's already taking place is that forestry scientists and naturalists are developing native tree stock in nurseries for future transplanting in the north areas, because the concern, if we're thinking about that disturbance, is that that the rapidity of change will be outpacing the ability for a forest to reseed itself. And so we don't know exactly how that's going to play out, but scientists are looking at developing some southern Minnesota tree species that are natives that will, as those planting zones shift, do better where we are, and starting to get more mature plants ready to kind of integrate into the forest so that we can keep viable forests growing. So that'll be something just to pay attention to, but also for us, as property owners, to think about. As time goes by, there are going to be different species across the state that you can bring in and add to your property over time. And again, it could be oaks, it could be maples, it could be, any of those keystone species are a wonderful place to start. The prunus family with choke cherries, things like that, the wonderful place to start. Another key point for planting for the future is understanding your specific site conditions and consider how they might be the most affected by climate change. So thinking about, exposure to wind and temperatures, and we'll be diving into that a little bit more. But if you take the time to really reflect on, and it might look different in different parts of your property, but what's the right plant, the right trees for the right place, and what are the best strategies for you? So we'll be covering that more. And then another key concept to keep in mind is really shifting that perspective from planting a lot of the same thing to planting diverse species groups together where possible. And so that could be a grove of one type of tree, but if we can bring in different types of tree species, they're going to be affected differently by climate change, by animal browsing and insects and things like that. And so, in the Twin Cities, for example, we'd see all these blocks lined with elm trees, right? And we all know what happened with that, where once something came in, Dutch elm disease came in, it decimated every city block in space. And so, we still see that to a certain extent in Minneapolis, where they're starting to plant a greater variety on every block of different types of tree species. And that's the way we need to be thinking on our own property as well, because they will all be affected differently. And it kind of helps us diversify our portfolio so that when there's negative effects, it doesn't take out our entire woodland setting. So here's a case example of a tree that I love and is very popular in our area, and it is native to northern Minnesota. It's the paper birch, Betula paprifera. Northern Minnesota represents the very southernmost range of the birch. And so it typically spreads way up into Canada, and we're right at the edge. It's a fast growing tree. It's one of those opportunistic trees that loves to move into a disturbed area. So it's not very shade tolerant because it comes into those sunny areas first and tends to grow in groups. It's not a very long-lived tree. They can live for a certain period of time, but not to the stature or time frame of like a white pine, for example. And they begin reproduction at approximately 15 years of age. And that's one thing that we need to keep in mind with trees, is they don't necessarily in year 2 or 3 become able to see different areas around them. And so They don't live that long, and they take a while to become mature enough to start reproducing with catkins. And another point is that they're not drought tolerant. They prefer really consistent moisture. And so you can see how that might be a negative effect in this era of climate change. I remember a couple of years ago when we were really under drought, watching all the leaves in July just fall off of my birch, and the aspens right next to it, which are more drought tolerant, did just fine. And they kept their leaves, but the birch was really at the effect of that pretty quickly. They prefer cool summers, not above 70 degrees. They love cold winters and consistent snow cover. So as we see snow cover becoming more patchy, and as we see winters warm and as we see summers warm, that's going to be particularly hard on the paper birch. They're still going to grow, but for example, they may do better closer to Lake Superior, where we're seeing our summers stay with that wonderful cooling, refrigerating effect we have from Lake Superior, those microclimate areas where it stays cooler during the summer overall, and perhaps more consistent moisture. We're seeing increasing insect damage due to tree stress and warming temperatures with the birch. And that's one thing to keep in mind is insects will attack every type of tree. They have species favorites, but if a tree is under stress, they're going to go after that particular tree the most. In a healthy group, if there's one that's under stress, they will go after that. So as our trees are stressed, we do tend to see more insect damage and more of that invasive species damage. And for birches, we see that from birch leaf miner, the bronze birch borer, and just newer invasive species coming in. And so if I'm going to forecast about this, I don't know what's going to happen for sure, but, based on all these things that we're breaking down and talking about, being sensitive to specific temperatures and specific needs around moisture, most likely we're going to see birches dwindle and move northward, except for those microclimate pockets. So that's one way that we can think about the birch in our area. It's not going to be one that, while I do love it, it's not going to be one that I prioritize for planting because the equation doesn't look very strong for it. But if I've got them on my property, or if any tree that I love, I'm going to plant. If I want to see it, I'm going to go for it and try to include all the species that I love. But in terms of that practical mindset, things are looking challenging for them being a widespread tree in our area. So the next section of what we're going to be going into, and I think I'll just pause here really quick before we kind of break down different trees and talk about those effects. Does anybody have any questions so far on climate change effects or anything that we've covered?
So far, nothing in the chat, but I would encourage you to put your questions in the chat. We'll happily read them off. If you're anything like me, it can be hard to remember all those questions for the end. So if you put them in chat, we'll happily take care of them.
Yep, thank you, by all means. So in this next section, I want to kind of go tree by tree that we see in our local area, and just kind of talk about how it seems like they're going to perform or adapt or struggle, as climate change happens over time, and just kind of what the needs of each tree are. It can be kind of overwhelming to understand all of that. So I'm just trying to kind of look at those key points for each one. So starting off with one of my very favorite trees, and one of kind of the original trees that we would see in a widespread way before European settlers came through and logged, was the white pine. And so it's a large canopy tree. I'm sure if you've been canoeing in the Boundary Waters, you've seen these huge sentinel trees, often with an eagle in them. And they just have so much character. They're really tall. And if you've ever planted them on a property, they can also grow to be very wide. Sometimes they're a little more narrow when they're growing, close to each other in a grove. But if you're planting it on your property, they're generally, and they're getting a good food source and good moisture, they can grow quite wide. So be careful in terms of planting with your dwelling and your property. They can recede areas after a fire because they are so tall and they're relatively fire resistant. And so if it's not the most damaging type of fire, so it's more of a ground fire and not a canopy level, very destructive fire, they can recede areas pretty quickly after a fire. And so they do have some resistance to that. They're fast growing. They prefer good drainage and acidic soils. And while we don't have a lot of soil up here, it is acidic, and we do tend to have some of that pine needle duft. Maybe it's pea gravel or kind of eroding rock. And, it's everything that we have tends to create relatively good draining soil. There's not a lot of clay up here. And they prefer full sun. The great thing about white pines is that they do well in a variety of climates and settings. And so they do well across the state in different areas. And so they're not going to be as sensitive to some of these hydration and water changes and some of these temperature changes. They do tend to struggle more in urban areas due to compaction, road salts, things like that. So I may not plant them right next to a driveway or right next to a sidewalk or a heavily traveled area. But if you've got, some space, some wild space, they're going to do really well. And it seems like they'll probably be able to weather a number of these changes, and be able to adapt to changing conditions. They can be affected by white pine blister rust. And so one fact that I wasn't aware of until I was researching for this was that means that they can be sensitive to gooseberries and currants, contributing to that on those trees. And so if you have a garden, really maybe don't plant your currants and your gooseberries right next to a white pine if at all possible. So in general, for white pines, I think they're going to be an adaptive species that I would prioritize in plantings. So the next one, a red pine, Pinus resinosa. Again, they're going to have a little bit more of an upright stature in that they have a longer needle than the white pine does. And I kind of think of them almost a little more as like a reversed umbrella a bit, a little more of an upright stature in tree shape, as you can see in that picture. They're another large canopy tree, so they grow to be quite tall. They prefer poor, sandy, and well-drained soil. So they don't need overly rich soil. They are shade intolerant, so they want to be in full sun. So if you have a more exposed area, and it could be maybe it's drier or rocky, that could be a great place to put a red pine in, or a grove of red pines. They do prefer cool summer climates. And so if you're seeing on your property more kind of extreme summer heat, they may not do as well in that. But they do just fine with some poorer soils, which is good to know about. What we're seeing in research is that the warming climate seems to be increasing their effects for greater pest and disease. And so that's something to keep in mind. Again, diversifying that tree portfolio on your property is a great way to counteract some of that risk. And I generally, because they can handle the dry and all of that, I would still keep them in the mix. If you're a red pine fan, by all means, I think they're a great tree. Next up, we have the sugar maple, Acer saccharum, and there's also a red maple as well, but this is a native Minnesota maple, and we see them in large stands, as we know, in our area, and they're kind of more a part of those pockets that we have currently of that mesic hardwood forest. And up until this point, it's been some of the moderating thermal effects of Lake Superior creating more temperate pockets farther north where these trees can thrive. And that looks to be potentially changing for this tree in particular for the positive over time, it would seem, with some more warmth. They're a medium to large canopy tree. They are slow growing. They prefer moist, well-drained, slightly acidic, and fertile soil. And so they are going to want more of a composted, rich soil if that's possible. They are shade tolerant. So that means that they're a good option for mixed forest planting. So bringing in, if you have a woodland where you've got a number of aging, mature, taller trees, maybe potentially bringing in some maples interspaced between them is a nice option. They are adaptable to a variety of conditions and settings, and they do well across the state. Again, they struggle in those urban settings where we see compaction in the ground, where we see salt from the roads. And so because they're adaptable to a variety of settings and conditions, they are a great option to consider over time. And I think overall what we're going to see are maple groves spreading as temperatures become more temperate and moderate. And so it's certainly a tree to pay attention to depending on your site conditions. They are susceptible to borer pests, especially during climate stress. And they can suffer from verticillium wilt, which can be lethal to the tree. Here's another one of my very favorite trees, the northern white cedar, the Thuja occidentalis. And it's a small to medium tree, mid-story at most. They prefer moist, well-drained soil and neutral or slightly alkaline soil, but they will tolerate dry soil. So you have the option of trying them in slightly drier areas and seeing how they do. They are slow growing. And so, I'm thinking of Little Spirit Tree up in Grand Portage. We've seen some of these amazing cedar trees growing in almost impossible settings, often rocky exposed areas where it seems unimaginable about how they're growing and receiving that moisture. And so they're a great option to think about. They do well in a mixed woodland setting. So again, even though they're slower growing, this could be another great tree to intersperse among more mature trees so that over time, they can come in and be a part of the woodland. They do prefer a cool climate. And so if you're closer to the North Shore and the lake, that might help to buffer some of those effects. They're not as susceptible to pests as some other trees. They're not completely impervious, but they don't struggle as much as some other species with pests. They'll winter scorch and kind of that burning that can happen in strong winter temperatures and drying out can be a problem. The very best sites for them have moving water in the soil. So think near streams and drainage ways. So if you happen to have, when I think of spring on the North Shore, it's kind of melt season more than anything. So if you have a constant stream or a seasonal stream, this could be a great place for some northern white cedar to grow, kind of stabilizing that soil so that you're preventing erosion near any runoff areas. And also they will thrive with that level of moisture coming through. Oh, back to one of my favorites that we already mentioned, the jack pine, Pinus banksiana. To me, they kind of look like a large scale bonsai tree. I think people kind of love these or hate these a little bit because they're very quirky. I think they're just really cool looking trees. I'm a big fan of them. They're a medium-sized tree, so they're not going to go all the way up into the canopy at the top, but they're a medium-sized tree. They are a part of that fire-dependent ecosystem for germination, as we talked about before. They prefer moist, well-drained, sandy, acidic soil, but they will tolerate dry sites again. I've often seen them, for example, growing in rocky areas when I've been at a BWCA camping site and thinking, how is this tree growing here? It's on the edge of the lake. Maybe it has a taproot going way underneath between the rocks, but on the surface, it's really dry. They prefer cool summers and cold winters. But this tree occurs throughout Minnesota. I believe it's our most widely spread evergreen tree throughout the state. So they can really handle a variety of conditions again. And so that leads to it as a good option and a good contender for changing, if you're an evergreen fan, as a good option for changing conditions over time. And they can actually grow in soils that are too poor for either the white or red pine. So even drier and poorer soil than the red pine likes. So I think there's a lot of points in jack pine's favor. They are very shade intolerant though. So if you've got an exposed spot with full sun, that's going to be the best place to put it. They do have a shallow root system. So keep that in mind because wind damage can be a problem in terms of windfall happening. So that's just one thing to be aware of. And again, kind of like the cedar, they're not as susceptible to pests. And so I think that's certainly a point in this quirky and wonderful tree's favor. So we could talk for a few days about all the different species that we have on the North Shore, and we don't have time to do that. So the trees that we talked about, I think are still really viable in terms of planting and really prioritizing. They will feel the effects of climate change. But I think that they're all, if you have some favorite trees of the ones that we've covered so far, I think they're going to be good contenders to find a space in a changing climate. The ones on this page are going to potentially struggle a little more or just have a different strategy that I would recommend. Aspen or the popple, I learned when I became a master naturalist that really it's the Duluth and North Shore area is the only place where they call them popples, and it's that aspen tree. So I thoroughly enjoy that. They are drought resistant. They grow in colonies. They're fast growing and they move into disturbed areas. So they can be somewhat aggressive, which frankly can be helpful if you're trying to stabilize or bring in trees to an area where there's been a lot of disturbance. My recommendation is to allow these trees to self-seed on your property and then select the winners. And what I mean by that is if it's not growing in a good spot, move it or, cull that particular tree. It's a lot easier to do this when they're young than it is once they become more mature. I'm a big fan of aspen trees. They seem like they will generally do well in changing circumstances. But we often have them already on our property. And so in terms of planting strategies, I'm probably going to bring in some of those big, key, larger scale trees that might take longer and prioritize those in key spots. And then let, for example, that aspen move in and self-seed around it and then create the areas where I want it to grow. I love tamarack trees. I just planted one actually on my property as a bit of an experiment to see how it does. They prefer bogs, peatlands, kind of those acid peat bog forests that are going to struggle more in climate change. That's their preferred habitat. They love being near running water. So one thing I'm thinking about is if you have any stream or just kind of seasonally moist areas where there's lots of runoff, cedars and tamaracks, kind of bringing in a mix of those is going to create beautiful foliage contrast. I mean, I love the tamarack for that really almost like a rainforest evergreen with those super soft needles. They turn bright gold in the fall. They're really a special tree. And so I'm trying to kind of experiment with them a bit about how I can bring them in to the area. They do grow well in mixed forest settings, like I was just speaking about, but they often then later get eliminated by other species that are more aggressive. So you may need to kind of hold the space or cull other trees around that tamarack if it's something that you want to keep. And they are vulnerable to pests like the larch sawfly, and we are really seeing a lot of pest effects with tamaracks. They are struggling a bit. And so if you love them and have a space for them, I think that they're also great because you can grow them near, I have an area with power lines. And so I'm bringing in things that won't grow too tall or have really rigid branches right next to a power line. And so that softer tamarack, I'm curious to see how that will do. So I love them. They are struggling a bit, but if you have that right moisture situation for them, I think they're a great tree. Spruce and balsam, as we've talked about before. And again, I love both of these trees. They're really fantastic. They do tend to broadcast and self-seed widely, especially the balsam tree. And what can happen is, again, they have this ongoing relationship with the spruce budworm, and we're going to see those cycles of damage. And what happens is it dries out and kills the trees, and that turns them into ladder fuel for really dangerous canopy fires. And we'll be talking more about planning for fires a little bit later on. But what I recommend again is to allow those trees to self-seed if they're on your property. You can certainly plant them if you love them and bring them in from the garden center if you'd like to do that. But they are going to have more problems with instability due to pests. So what I like to do if they're already on the property is to allow them to self-seed, move them around if there's a better spot, select those winning trees that are in the right place. And then make sure to cull and remove any extra trees and any dead wood out, because it really does create a fire risk. And so generally I'm prioritizing and thinking about other trees like the white pine, like the cedar, like the red pine, for example, or jack pine, a little bit more as a planned species. But these are great in that woodland mix as well, as long as we're mitigating those fire risks.
Hey, Anna.
Yep.
On the topic of spruce, I don't know if you saw Betsy's question in the chat or not.
I haven't yet. Would you mind reading that one off to me?
Yep. Betsy asks, what information do you have on spraying fir and spruce for the prevention of spruce budworm? Is BT recommended and is it effective? I am thinking of trees on my property.
Sure. So I know a little bit about that. I'd have to do some more research to give you a really detailed answer, Betsy. So by all means, feel free to connect with me and we can dialogue a bit. What I do know is that some of those sprays, if it's a larger woodland that's being managed, I think it can be a little more effective if it's larger scale, but it's more problematic in kind of on a smaller property. And so generally, I think the sprays are not highly recommended to use. the biggest thing to do for spruce budworm is trying to isolate and cut down those infected trees. When they're looking at woodland management, if you have a lot of those trees, they recommend cutting them down as soon as you see signs of infection so that you have an undamaged tree that you could potentially use as a wood product and not waiting for the damage to happen. But also in terms of what to do is isolating any trees, creating space between your trees, and removing any trees that seem to be affected. Creating that space between the trees slows down the rates of infection and allows, while those caterpillars are going to move around, it makes it harder for them to move from tree to tree. And it also means that there's going to be smaller amounts of damage over successive years versus a lot of damage to everything all at once because they're in close quarters. So I would, in the research that I've done, I would encourage more spacing of trees versus spraying of trees. So here's a super long list of places to get started for shrubs and trees, kind of that lower area of the woodland. And in specific, these are all great. They're all native species, and most of them are, if it's in bold, it's something that we see up in, Lake County and Cook County. So they're local native plants. There's a couple that are native to Minnesota on here, but are not as much in our area that could be planted. But all of these are going to give you, in addition to some of the trees that we've talked about, I struggle a little bit with tree pollen and allergies, but that early tree pollen, those early bloom times for any of our trees, but especially these trees and shrubs that are going to fruit later on in the season and have early spring flowers, create really great conditions for pollinators, birds, and local wildlife to get a meal just as life is beginning to green up again in the spring. So this is a really long list. It could be a great chance to take a screenshot or something like that and come back to. A couple places I love to start though are serviceberry, also known as Juneberry, and then red twig osier dogwood. They're both going to be blooming beautifully in the spring. I love those snowy flowers on the serviceberry. My kids and I love eating the berries off of our Juneberry or serviceberries, and I love watching. I'll get rose-breasted grosbeaks and waxwings coming in flocks to eat serviceberries when they're ripe in the summer. So that's a beautiful place to start. And they're kind of they're going to go 12 to 20 feet high generally, and they can be more of a shrub form or a tree form. And so they mix really well into a woodland with a variety of species. And red twig dogwoods are going to be more of a shrub stature, but they do really well. And one thing I always like to point out is that as they mature, they can become less bright red, but they do really well if you cut them right to the ground, and they will grow back up with kind of thin, more whip-like bright red sticks. And so you can rejuvenate them if they're starting to look a little bit less vibrant. And so those do really well in the landscape, as well as a variety of these do. And also red twig dogwoods, you can take whips or thin young branches and cut them right below a leaf node and plug them right into the ground. So if you already have some dogwoods on your property and you want to move them, especially maybe for erosion control, you can cut these young branches up below that leaf node, plug them into the ground. As long as there's moisture, they will root and start a new shrub for you. So that's a really great no-cost solution for getting some more dogwoods on your property. So planning for your woodland, there's a lot here, and on the right side, I've got a quick guide to planting a tree. We will go over in a little bit because I always want to talk about those fundamentals for putting a tree in the ground yourself. Things to think about in terms of planning for your woodland and assessing your property is thinking about seasonal sources of moisture, those runoff streams, and consistent sources of moisture. What does that look like on your property? How dry is it? There's probably a tree to match what is happening on your property for that. How much sun and shade are happening? We see in the spring, a lot more sunlight is filtering in before those leaves come in. And so what we want to do is think about planting spring ephemerals that are covering a food source for pollinators, and to go ahead and get them into the environment right in the spring when there's more light coming in to the bottom of the woodland setting. We want to think about temperature averages and zones, as we know those have been shifting across the state. And, where we are in a warmer zone right along the north shore of Lake Superior. And we go up into the Sawtooth a little bit and suddenly we're zone 3. So it can really change depending on elevation and proximity to the lake. But just understanding what zone you're in and looking at how temperatures are changing on your property. And then looking at proximity to Lake Superior, including water vapor, how many of those foggy days, which a lot of these trees like cedars really appreciate that water vapor in the air, and understanding the thermal loading of cooling our summers and warming our winters from the lake, and how does that affect trees, and is that affecting your property more? Understanding your soil acidity, the substrate type in terms of drainage and the kind of the physical makeup of that soil. The drainage from that soil and the level of nutrition in the soil. And we could teach a whole class on soil health, and we probably should. But those are things to just explore, even just holding it in your hand, getting a sense of that makeup of it. And then looking on your property in terms of vulnerability to wind and fire. And also the location of any power lines, septic systems, roads, and beach frontage on your property, and thinking about how you want to plant strategically for those. And specifically, we don't want to be planting trees and shrubs or anything woody or anything with tap roots on septic systems. So that's just a good thing to keep in mind. That's a great place for those kind of herbaceous perennial native plants. And I need to go grab my charger really quickly and plug in. I'll be right back and we'll talk about the quick guide to planting a tree.
Well, I have a little moment. I'm just gonna again mention that we have had the North Shore Forest Collaborative that has talked about what to plant under power lines, as well as what is a good idea for helping restore forests in our area. So I will be putting those into the chat area for you to check out as well. And if you have suggestions that come out of this training of things you'd like to see in the future, please let us know. This is a great topic. I think something that's very important to all of us as we live in a great, beautiful place. So we want to make sure we're taking good care of it for the future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelsey. So a few fundamentals for planting a tree. One thing that we want to keep in mind that we may not realize that is happening is that roots can get girdled in a lot of the shrubs and trees that we buy because they've spent a lot of time in a pot. And so those roots tend to grow in a circle and they can strangle the tree. And we may not realize it until 5 years down the road when all of a sudden our tree just gives out and we don't know why. It's often due to root girdling. And so when I take a tree or shrub out of that nursery plastic pot, I want to break up the soil a little bit and make sure that it's not root bound and that all of the roots are kind of going in different directions a little bit if I can. And then what I want to do is figure out where's that root flare on the tree or shrub. And what we're specifically talking about is that area where it just comes out just a little bit wider from the base of the tree going down into the soil. And what we want to do is plant that slightly above the surface, not below. And this is another spot where a lot of plant nurseries, I think, tend to dump soil in. And so if you're seeing just a straight stick going down into soil, it's probably buried in soil too much. So we want to kind of just find that place where the main part of the tree flares out slightly. And when we're planting it, have that be slightly above the soil surface, not below. And that's going to just help stop root rot, disease, and getting too much moisture going in the wrong places. So when we're creating a space to plant a new tree, we don't need to dig that deeply, actually. We want to dig a hole that is the same height as the root ball of the tree, because we don't want it to sit too low and have water pool in there, but we do want to dig it twice as wide. We want to really break up that soil, aerate it, loosen it so that it's very easy for roots to start moving away from the tree, stabilizing it and giving them greater access to nutrients. So twice as wide, but the same height as the root ball. This can be a nice opportunity. You can actually purchase mycorrhizal fungi powder if you'd like, and if you can just sprinkle it, it's a great dry powder that you can sprinkle in and amongst the roots of a new tree, and it just helps encourage those mycorrhizal fungal networks to set up. That starts giving the tree greater nutrition and connecting it to the rest of the forest. And so it's a great thing to do if you have that interest. You can top dress with compost depending on the species. A lot of these species don't need super rich soil. But for those that do, I tend to put it more on the top so that roots are going out towards it, unless your soil is really poor and dry, and then you can put some in the base of the hole that you've dug. But generally having it move out towards that nutrition is a good strategy. We don't want to have mulch volcanoes. If you are planting a new tree on your property and maybe there's a lot of grass around it, mulching is a good idea. Again, doing that with compost or with, a hardwood shredded mulch is nice because it doesn't float away in rain events. That's a good idea, but we don't want to have these giant domes of mulch because it actually absorbs the little rainfall that we get and it doesn't get down to the tree, and it's counterproductive. So I tend to think of it with a 3-3-3 mulching rule, which is starting your mulch about 3 inches from the trunk of the tree. So it's got a little room around it where it's just soil. And then having it be about 3 inches deep, no more, straight across with that mulch, and then about 3 feet wide out in a circle around the tree. So that mulching will help trees retain moisture. This can also be done if you're coming into more of an established woodland area. If you've got pine needle duff, leaves, broken small branches, what's on your property already can act as a really good compost. And that's actually the safest type of compost to use because we're not bringing in, again, any of those invasive critters in bagged mulch that we may not even see. So if you're able to create your own on-site green mulch, that's a great thing to do. One thing that we often forget about with new trees is that they need to be watered, in between rains for about the first year, as those roots are getting established. And often, actually, sometimes larger trees will struggle more than younger trees. And so there's certain areas where I'll put in a large tree, but often I pick those baby trees because they will be more resilient in times of stress because their root network is not as mature. The more roots they are and the bigger the tree, the more water it needs at a time. And so sometimes they can be more likely to experience stress and strain in a dry environment. And so sometimes planting a younger tree that takes a little longer to mature will pay off more consistently. One thing I like to keep in mind with that is that watering in the fall is really important with young trees if it hasn't been a wet fall, because they don't get a drink all winter long, which seems really counterintuitive with all the snow that gets dumped on us. But they will be drinking up until frost. So if you have a young tree and if it's been drier, maybe put a drip hose out on it, just to make sure that it's getting that water before things freeze out and it kind of dries out during its kind of hibernation and restorative time over the winter. And then finally, something we want to do is just cage young trees to prevent that really destructive browsing from deer or maybe rabbits in the winter. And so caging those trees with stakes, you can use a fairly wide gauge mesh screen. It doesn't have to be super tiny, but that's just a great protective thing to do for our trees when they're young. Now, I think I saw a few more things light up in the chat. Are there any more questions I can answer right now?
You're doing good. I'm just tossing in some information for people.
Oh, good. Thank you. I appreciate that, Kelsey. And thank you for being my slide extraordinaire person as we're going through this. Okay, so we're nearing the end of my slides, but I want to talk a little bit about design and being creative. We've been talking about a lot of these practical components that go into a woodland area. Some of this we've covered already, but in terms of design, I like to think of my woodland garden in terms of those kind of 3 areas. The tree canopy area, where do I need to bring in some larger trees in to kind of flesh out the area? Maybe my woodland has some older trees that are towards the end of their life cycle, and I want to bring in some more shrubs or understory trees like that serviceberry to come in, or maybe a mountain ash. Again, the waxwings love those as well. Looking at what are some of those understory trees or shrubs, elderberry, wild rose, dogwoods, what can we bring in and amongst that? So we're planting at all 3 areas. And then the lowest level are those blooming perennials. And this is an area I really love. There's a wide variety of pretty either early spring ephemeral plants So it's beautiful, like we see this trillium up in the right corner, some of these fleeting, beautiful flowers in the spring. And also some that are more shade tolerant because they evolved in more shady woodland areas. There's types of goldenrod that are more shade tolerant. I'm a huge fan of that red columbine that we see in a lot of forested setting that grows early and it's really beautiful. We have you may have heard of Virginia bluebells. We have actually our own native type of bluebell that is more forest specific. I believe the botanical name is Mertensia paniculata. So that paniculata is what sets it apart as the Minnesota type of bluebell, but they're stunning. And I see those growing wild with kind of pink and blue and purple flowers depending on age. And so there's a lot that we can bring in growing right, non-woody perennials on, the floor of our woodlands that enhance all of the life in that area. So the next bullet we've already talked a decent amount about, but just thinking seasonally about light and water. Is there more light and moisture on your property in the spring? How does this change in your space throughout the season? And in terms of a bloom calendar, is there an area where, a gap in your calendar where you're not seeing as many blooms? Can you bring in some more fall-based asters or goldenrods because you're not seeing as many flowers in the fall? Or is spring the time where you're seeing fewer flowers? So looking at creating consistent blooming in a woodland garden is possible with some of these shade-tolerant species. For plant selection, I like to think seasonally about color and privacy. And so can I create winter color and interest? And can I create food sources for wildlife? So I love some of these winter bearing, like the mountain ash. There's different things we can bring in that are creating food sources. We also see plenty of that with our evergreens creating food sources with their pine cones for various critters as well. Dogwoods are beautiful in the winter, for example, with their bright red. So I'm thinking about when I look out my window and I can't go outside, but I can look out and see the beauty or watch the birds flying out amongst the trees. What can I be bringing in for that visual beauty and also that wildlife interest? Again, we've talked about spring wildflowers for seasonality, also summer fruits and cooling shade. Maybe I'm trying to create an edible property where I am. So having all kinds of berries throughout the year that I can enjoy and also local animals can enjoy as well. And there's nothing I love better than seeing my kids jump off their bikes and going into the middle of a berry patch and just, they don't bring any out because they've eaten them all while they're in there and they're just so happy. So that's something that we can do in a woodland setting as well. And then again, fall leaf color change. So whether that's maples or tamaracks or service berries or blueberries have stunning fall foliage, we can really create beautiful design points of contrasting foliage in the woodland to enjoy in the fall. And on the right side, I have just a few pointers in thinking about design. I like to create a woodland as an experiential setting, something that I can walk through and have kind of a meditation moment with, or make it more experiential versus just staring at it from the side. And so looking again at where we want to review and add large or understory trees, see what's missing in the landscape, consider adding a meandering pathway and maybe a bench to take you on that journey so that you're moving in a meditative kind of circuitous place throughout the forest area that you have. And then you can mulch that path to kind of delineate it from the rest of the forest setting. And when I'm doing that, I want to also then from my pathway or from my bench area, think about, is there key visual points where I can add flowering shrubs or perennials? Where do I want to see those where they really stand out? Is it creating bluebells right along the pathway, for example, or wild roses right along the pathway or next to that bench? And so you can think about a woodland as a place that you go visit and take walks on and how you'd like to design that. And again, we spoke about those native spring ephemerals and those shade tolerant perennials that can self-seed and spread throughout your woodland over time. And Boreal Natives and some other local businesses specialize in having more of those native boreal and forest-based perennials that you can bring in. All right, so we've talked about some creative stuff. Here's kind of some of the most important practical stuff we can do in terms of safety on our property. And I know that that's hit really close to home for a number of us over the past few years in terms of thinking about things drying out, either human started or storm started forest fires. And so again, forest fires can vary in terms of intensity and also in terms of level of devastation. Surface level fires are a lot less, or ground level fires are less dangerous, even though they can be destructive. The forest can survive them more than if the fire gets all the way up into the canopy of the trees. Then that can be hugely destructive and harder for the forest to come back from. So we've got a few different zones. If you're thinking about your dwelling, your house, that's going to be right in the center of our map here. Zone 1, the structure zone, is your house and the area right around the house. What we want to do and look and see if there's any wicks, thinking about that candle, what that can carry fire to the structure. So if you have a wood pile really close to your house, if you have a branch right over non-fire resistant roofing on your house, we want to have fire resistant roofing, and we don't want to have branches that could lead or bring that fire right to the dwelling. So walking around and figuring out what can we move out to create that barrier around the dwelling. And if we are going to bring in vegetation, which I'm not averse to, we want it to be low growing. And we want it to be widely spaced. And they do, if you go on the DNR Firewise webpage, you can just Google that. They do have some Firewise plants they recommend. But generally, if it's greener, not prone to dry out, and not a woody plant, which is kind of bad for our foundations anyways, those greener perennials are going to do well. So that's something to keep in mind right around your structure. In zone 2, that next kind of layer out or circle out from the dwelling, that's your defensible space. We're talking probably ballpark within, 6 to 15 feet, from your dwelling. What we want to do is break up any contiguous fuel sources. And we want to break them up with, this is a great role for if you have a lawn or want a lawn or a bee lawn, like Jacob's going to teach about in the fall, well irrigated grass, short mown grass, or using gravel or rock paving to kind of break up those, those areas of fuel. Those are your fire breaks. So what is it? We can have design components closer to the house. What we want to do, for example, if you're creating a pollinator garden, maybe it's a veggie garden, pollinator garden, or you have evergreen trees, plant them as small islands and then break them up, as we talked about, in between. So islands are a more effective setting or structure for creating beauty near to your home, but have it not be a continuous screen where it could just all burn at once. So breaking things up into islands is beautiful and effective. And we also want to, generally in zone 2 and 3, we really want to work to space the trees out and maintain the crowns so that they're at least 10 feet apart. And this is especially true for those evergreen trees. And what we want to do is prune off the lower branches of a tree up to 6 to 10 feet tall, because we're breaking up that ladder fuel from ground to mid tree. We want to get rid of that. So if you think about that white pine earlier that can reseed after a forest fire has come through, it's typically because those lower branches on a mature tree have come down or broken off, and it's just the trunk. And so fires can come through, but not get up into the canopy. What we want to do generally with pruning, though, is we don't want to prune more than 1/3 of a live crown, that green part of the tree, at a time. You want to have about 60% of your total tree height from ground to the top of the tree. 60% should be green and alive and not pruned off. So as trees mature, we just want to create that space between ground and the beginning of that crown where possible. And of course, any dead wood we really want to take out. Zone 3, that kind of final donut or that final area farthest away from your dwelling, is your general management zone. And that is the area where, you might have more consecutive woodland spaces, but we want to go in, we want to reduce those ladder fuels, removing that tall underbrush. Any deadfall, we want to really remove as much as possible between the tops of the understory plants and the lower branches of the overstory trees. And this helps to reduce those dangerous crown fires. So this is an area where you might have more of that extended woodland, but we can go and we can pick those winning trees. We can cull the ones that are not in the right spot, create that spaciousness. And as we talked about earlier, that also helps to negate some of the effects of spruce budworm or different pests when we're spacing trees out to a certain extent. That's also bringing in more light and water into the woodland as well. So we just want to have those strategic trees getting their needs met so they can grow grow in a healthy way and not be as stressed. So this is my final slide, I believe. This just has a few resources. And then in the time after that, the few minutes we have left, if anybody has any questions or wants to kind of workshop or brainstorm about specific property questions, I'm happy to talk about that. So a few places, and I think that already Kelsey's may have been sharing some of this, but the North Shore Forest Collaborative is an awesome resource to learn more. They also do a lot of great local tree and fencing giveaways, as I believe Headstrom Lumber does one as well. But North Shore Forest Collaborative, I think I'm taking part in a fencing giveaway they're doing this spring. So they have a lot of great resources and information. Cook County Soil and Water is wonderful for classes, for information, and also for partnering with homeowners to restore areas facing erosion, woodlands, things like that. They will partner with homeowners in a variety of ways. So they're a great resource to know about. University of Minnesota Cloquet Forestry Center is doing a lot of really interesting forest research. It's a great place to visit and spend the day. But you can follow them on social media as well. And they have classes. I think they had one just on the white pine that I was hoping I could take. So they really will specialize and give you a lot of great forest information. We talked about the Homegrown National Park website. And so here's the URL for that. If you want to learn how to certify your backyard as a wildlife habitat, there's great info there and just a ton of resources. It's a really great program. The Climate Change Tree Atlas, this is through the Forest Service. And so it's looking at how climate change is affecting different trees in different ways and what that looks like geographically. And then finally, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, just the Minnesota Forest Ecosystem Vulnerability Assessment specific to our area. There's a report there that if you really want to kind of dig deep and find out more of the details, that's some good information there as well. So I believe that's all I have, but I think there's one final slide, maybe just about ways that we can help. We do offer garden coaching and mentoring as master gardeners, and we can come out and do on-site consultations or Zoom consultations. We have a resource library at the extension office. And we typically have a table now at Thursday Farmers Market. So it's a great place to stop by. And a lot of us wear both that master naturalist and master gardener hat. And so we love answering, any type of gardening for wildlife type questions that you may have. And we have a variety of classes, including this one where it is recorded. You can come back and watch it again. And, please do reach out and contact us if there's a way that we can partner with you to help you meet your gardening, your woodland dreams, and make all those goals happen for you. So thank you for your attention tonight. And if there's anybody that has questions, I would love to hear them and help out in any way I can.
Well, thank you so much. Gosh, so much great information. And I have sat through a lot of these presentations at this point. And each one I learned something more. I'm sure that's true for so many other people here too. I encourage you to unmute yourself if you'd like, or put your questions into the chat. I wanted to mention that I put into the chat some information about Sugarloaf's project that they do. Whose land is this? That is a really fascinating one about understanding the property you own and the trees on it and what can be done there. And I'm going to do a big shout out for the Master's Gardener. I had a plum tree in my yard and I did not know why it was dying. And I invited over one of the Master Gardeners, and they did a wonderful job saying, this is what's happening. And we were able to figure out solutions. And that was just a wonderful advice that otherwise in so many places you wouldn't have. So we are very privileged to have such resources in our community. Any questions you guys might be having?
What would be a way to maybe connect with you about maybe just questions about the spruce budworm treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing is just to kind of Google, and it might be on that last resource page, but if you go out to Cook County Extension Master Gardener and you just Google that, we have a whole page, and there should be an Ask a Master Gardener link there right on our main Cook County Master Gardener page. And then also Sarah Waddle, who I think is SWADDLE. I'll say that again, SWADDLE@umn.edu. I believe that's her email address. She is our master gardening coordinator and Cook County Extension coordinator. And so she is, and she's often in the community center. So if you drop on into the office, she's a great resource. She's also a master naturalist. And so she can help you connect with one of us. But right on that main page of our Cook County Master Gardening website, by all means, let us know and you can get matched up with one of us to answer any questions for sure.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks. Because I know that a local pest control company advertised, spraying, but it sounded like it was, I don't know much about the chemical. It wasn't BT or the Bacillus thuringiensis or however you say that, but yeah, I will check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, and different people have different mindsets on that. And so generally, as master gardeners, we teach more integrated pest management, which is doing as many mechanical controls, cultivation controls, and then as a last resort, using pesticides or using chemicals, because they do have a role. And there's times, for example, with like sometimes invasive tree species coming, and the only way to stop them is to paint them, with a control. Sure. So that they do have a place, but generally what's most effective, again, are more of those, what we call mechanical controls, that spacing and things like that. But so we try to do a lot of education about all those options that you have heard that before, so we don't go to spraying as the first option, but it's certainly something in the mix to consider.
Yeah, and I think another program that was offered by higher ed, talked about targeting those big trees that you really want to kind of protect. And so, yeah, thanks very much.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. I still invite others to ask questions. We got a little bit more time. But I gotta say, maybe there's some more collaborative with the North Shore Forest Collaborative that can bring you back, because we work with them about once a year on a presentation too. And they usually bring in some key speakers. And I think you have such great knowledge that would collaborate well with them.
Yeah, I love it. And another thing too that folks can do, if anybody has, we kind of just brainstorm together about what classes sound fun this year. But if there's something specific, maybe there was one area in this presentation, like woodland gardens, or, like last year we taught on planting on or near septic systems and septic holding tanks. And so if there's a specific area that, you'd love to hear more about, by all means, send that to that Cook County Master Gardening page. And we would love to put together workshops based on community feedback, because that's really why we're here.
And just a reminder, I'll be doing a follow-up email. So if you didn't catch everything in the chat, no pressure. I'll be sending it back to you.
Yeah, we covered a lot tonight. I was trying to take breaks to kind of slow down a little bit, but there's so much that we could cover and so much more that we didn't even get to. But my hope is that this kind of helped put a lot of those big puzzle pieces together, so that when you're reviewing your own site at home, you can know what to consider and kind of put those glasses on in terms of what's going to be most adaptive and resilient for your property over time.
I want to toss out also that we sometimes have book groups that are on topics. We recently did the Fen Bog, something, I can't think of the last name of it. And that was one that was also brought for the community, said they wanted to talk about it. And that was a really important one around a lot of these topics. So if there's a book group that maybe wants to be speaking about a book that would be connected to this, we're happy to do that as well.
Yep.